Hi, I'm Sid, co-founder CEO at GitLab, and I'm here today with Miki, and we're going to do an interview about remote work. Miki works at Job Portraits. Do you want to introduce yourself and kick us off with a question, Miki?
Sure. Thanks so much, Sid. Yeah, so I'm one of the co-founders of Job Portraits, and we're an employer branding agency, but we also help different teams create content around all sorts of things related to people ops. And so we're working on a story on remote work, and we're excited to talk with the GitLab team. Honestly, I knew about you guys before, but I've been really diving into a lot of your documents about how to work remotely, preparing for this, and it's so inspiring. Our team is remote also, and I feel like we can really utilize a lot of what you have. So thanks for talking with us.
Yeah, our pleasure, and that's great to hear.
Yeah, for sure. So let's see. Maybe we can start kind of high level here. I know that having a remote distributed team is something that you guys have been doing from the very beginning. Can you tell us about that decision? Like, why did you decide on that?
Yeah, my co-founder was from the Ukraine, and our first employee was from Serbia. I was in the Netherlands and didn't have a lot of money, so we kind of couldn't afford to bring everyone together. Then we hired people in the Netherlands, and they came to my place. I had a spare desk in a room where I worked, and they came for a couple of days, and I started working from home because everyone was doing that. We were set up that way. After we did Y Combinator in 2015, we were 9 people, and that was not remote. That was everyone in a house together. It's almost the opposite, living together. We got an office. Got 10 desks in it, and we figured we'd be a co-located company. But people kind of stopped showing up after a couple of days because there was no need to, and it tends to be an hour-long one-way commute in the Bay Area, so they saved a bunch of time. And that kind of happened every time. We hired an exec, and they said, it's not going to work for this or that, so I got to we got to be co-located with my team. And we're like, that's totally cool. We got a lot of empty desks here, so bring the team in. And then they joined, and they figured how everything worked, and then they didn't see a need, and they saved some time on their own commute. So I think at 100 or 200 people, we decided to make it official. Okay, we're going to be all remote, and we're going to accommodate for it. And we already put some practices in place, and since then we've done more practices to not be like remote as a worse version of being co-located, but do things that you can only do when you're remote, and things that make it better, and be intentional about the informal communication that you need.
Yeah, that's great. That makes a lot of sense. And I'm curious, what are those things that you feel like you can only do when you're remote, or what are some of the benefits that you guys see from this arrangement?
Yeah, so things that you can only do remote. We have a travel stipend, so you visit other team members, and we get you a couple $100 per team member. Some people kind of plan a route visiting many team members. Our single team member in Hawaii is getting a lot of visitors. Another thing we get to do is we bring everyone together. And because there's not a certain nexus, we are pretty open to where that is. So we tend to visit a very interesting and beautiful location, and we get to do excursions there. So those are things I think are much easier when you're remote. And just another thing is like this call, like we record it, and the recording is going to be pretty good because we all have a good webcam and audio, and we're not filming some table where there's a small dot of a person at the end of it. So recording things and writing things down is, I think, another big benefit of remote that allows companies to scale better.
Yeah, for sure. Darren, I don't know if you want to add anything in. I'm especially interested in if you see benefits around hiring too, because that seems like it could be a big, benefit.
Yeah, from my POV on the hiring front, one of the beauties of all remote is that everyone is on a level playing field. And I've worked in remote environments where there have been various headquarters, and then there was a small subset of people that were remote. And regardless of how hard the HQs tried, the remote people would always miss out on information. There would always be kind of hallway chatter or elevator chatter. You miss out on a few things, and then that accumulates to a medium-sized thing and then a large thing, and you just spend a lot of mental energy every day just trying to capture information that people share on site, but then forget to distribute far and wide. So when your whole team is remote, you don't have that problem because everyone is always cognizant of the fact that no one is next door to them. They can't just walk over, tap their shoulder. So it reinforces how much we need to document everything. And this is something that all companies should do, the documentation far and wide. But as a remote team, we think about it all the time. We're forced to do it. So it becomes more of a habit and less of a chore. And when people are coming in, one of the things we like to say is you don't have to sacrifice your career just because you don't want to or aren't willing to or can't relocate to a major job center like London, Singapore, San Francisco. A lot of people have family commitments and community commitments where they need to stay where they're at, but they still have a lot to give on the career front. And in an all remote company, you aren't judged based on your geography. We'll take all the insight and knowledge and help we can get wherever that may be. So I think people love being able to come in with that level playing field, and they don't feel like they're kind of a second-class citizen if they don't choose to move to HQ. A lot of times what happens is promotions and raises tend to go to people that show up in person a lot.
Right.
We're humans. We tend to just have a bias to prefer people we see more often when we have that physical contact. And in an all remote setting, you don't have to worry about that. And it's an amazing, liberating feeling to not have to sweat that and try to balance, like, should I up and move so I can be in person, or should I stay remote? When it's all remote, it's more of a level field on that front.
Yeah, for sure. I think the documentation thing must be huge. I know, like, one of the things we're curious about is, how does this remote situation really set you guys up for long-term success as a company? And it seems like one of the things is that it's really forcing documentation, right? Which, like, everyone knows is a positive, but like you said, it's more of a habit than a chore where it is most places. Do you guys have any examples of, like, a place where documentation was really important and you know that you just, like, have more of it because of this situation, or a place where, like, your good communication habits feel like they really helped you as a business on a larger front?
I think that in general, remote forces you to do things you should be doing anyway, earlier and better and more extensively. And the documentation is a good example. We're a fast growing startup. We're growing from 400 to over 1,000 people this calendar year. And that means that if you don't have a great onboarding, and if people have to ask questions in order to know in order to do their job, you're going to have a lot of inefficiency and long ramp-up times. And we're not perfect, but our handbook is over 3,000 pages. I think for a company our size, it's the most extensive resource that a company ever made. So that's been really, really helpful to get people onboarded quickly, get them effective quickly. And because people don't get a lot of questions that are mundane or repetitive, people also report that people are so responsive to questions at GitLab.
Yeah, that's interesting. So it's like the onboarding is really great because the documentation is really great, and then people probably get interrupted with silly questions a lot less, right? Because there's, like, great onboarding and documentation. And then you said people are more responsive too. Where does that piece fit in?
Because suppose, like, most people are doubling their team, there's some teams that are tripling. If you're tripling your team as a manager and everyone asks the same 10 questions, they need to do their job, you're going to zone that out. Like, you're not going to be as responsive to questions, hoping that someone else will pick up the slack just because you don't have that many hours in a day. And because that's not happening, it's like a universal thing where people say, people at GitLab are so good at answering questions. Yeah, because you ask a lot fewer than you did at your last job.
Huh. Interesting. That's so, yeah, I never would have thought of that. That makes so much sense. But it's like your managers can really focus on adding value and being helpful where they really need to be, because they're not just sort of answering 50 million of the same questions, right?
Exactly.
Darren, jump in.
Yeah, I was just going to say that we love to answer questions with a link. So if someone asks you a question that you've never heard before and we can't find it already answered, we love that because we'll answer it and then we'll publish it to the handbook and then send you the link with the answer. Therefore, anyone that comes after you, even 5, 10, 20 years from now, there's documentation of that answer where you can just answer with a link. And I think this is really big for cultural sustainment as well. If you look at a company that's been around 40 or 50 years, as a new hire, you come in and you try to get a beat on what the company's about, what the workflows are about. You just kind of get a hand-me-down of a hand-me-down of a hand-me-down over decades. And so whatever you hear is just kind of like the most recent or the most topical. If it wasn't documented from the very beginning, how do you even see how it has evolved over time, what changes have been made, what's true, and what's just someone's opinion of it? So that documentation from the very beginning is crucial when it comes to buy-in around the values and avoiding value apathy and the dysfunction that comes with that.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I want to dig into the handbook for just a sec because it is so extensive. It's such an incredible resource. And I'm super curious about how it gets built. So like you said, and I've read a little bit about your process, so I think I get it, but I'd love to hear you guys talk about it. So the idea of like answering with a link is the idea that like if there's a question that comes up and it's not addressed anywhere, that sort of anyone that in the company has the like authority to then say, here's the answer and put it directly into the handbook. And then what's the process kind of after that? Because I think a lot of people think this is a nice idea, right? To have this much transparency or this much ownership distributed, but then leadership gets like nervous of like, oh, what's going to happen if we really let people do that? So I'd love to have you guys kind of speak to, how do you think about like that decentralized control of something like a handbook?
Yeah, so the handbook is not about decentralized control at all. We're not some kind of kumbaya organization. We're a hierarchical organization. And with the handbook, it's really important to us that there's a split between the person who can propose things and the person who merges them in. And I'm on the record saying that wikis don't scale for this reason. With wikis, it tends to be the same person and doing that in one action. And at scale, I don't think that works. With us, our mission is everyone can contribute. So even if you don't work at GitLab, you can suggest an improvement to the handbook. But it's up to the person who like has to do the work. So the work described, and that's part of the handbook to actually merge it. And if, for example, it's about the values, it probably end up at my desk, my virtual desk. Let's call it like it is, my Slack feed. So what we try to do is either the person who like gives an answer documents it, or the person who got the answer documents it, which is much more rare. So that's still something to work on. But it also means that the leadership tends to have little time. So it's really important to have everyone in the company contributing changes to the handbook. And we want to keep kind of the bar to doing that very low. And every day there's tens and tens of changes made to the handbook by all kinds of people.
But so basically like, and I know you guys are really big on the merge request, right? Like everything starts with the merge request. I read that. So the idea is people can make suggestions, but then there's still someone sort of like ultimately making the decision of what actually gets merged in or doesn't.
Exactly.
Okay. I'm wondering a little bit about like what company, are there companies that you would not recommend full remote to? Or maybe another way of asking it is like, what does a company need to have to be able to do full remote, right? Like what are the potential downfalls of it, or how does it not work for companies?
Yeah, I think you shouldn't do all remote when you have a physical component to your business. So if you're running a storefront, if you're doing hardware, in those cases, I don't think it makes sense. So, but if your company is composed of knowledge workers who produce digital output, then I do think it's the new way of working, and I think it's going to take over the world. I think most new companies will start off like this very soon. And you're starting to see that trend at startups today, where a significant new percentage of startups are being built all remote from the beginning.
And where do you see that trend coming from, or why do you think that that's happening so prevalently?
I think it's possible now. Like, the tools have been getting better. Mm-hmm. Even in this call, your internet was not perfect at a certain point. Like, the internet is only now catching up to like being reliable enough to do it. Mm-hmm. And there's tools like Slack, Zoom, Google Docs, and lots of functionality in GitLab that help with getting there. On the other hand, there's the reasons to do it. Those are still the same. Like, getting everyone together is extremely expensive, and you end up in like major tech hubs that are very quickly getting expensive as well. But they've always been expensive, so I don't think that's changed. I think that what changed is it's possible now. The tools are good enough.
Mm-hmm. Darren, I don't know if you have anything to add to that either.
Yeah, I think people are becoming cognizant of the fact that asking people to commute 30, 60, 90, 120 minutes a day instead of being productive. I mean, when you have to justify that over hundreds or thousands of employees, I mean, if you really seriously ask yourself that question, is that a good use of time? It's becoming not such a clear answer that it is. Same thing on real estate. I mean, how much are you spending on real estate that you could plow into R&D, or people, or acquisitions, anything other than a building that may not be necessary? So even if you just break it down from a financial standpoint, the questions are starting to be asked, like, is this the wisest use of time and resource? And people are just being more vocal now about, like, why do I have to do this commute? I mean, that's just the bottom line. It's like, we only get one life. Is this really the way you want to spend it day to day?
I think that's much more important, because commute time was not coming from the employer, right? You get hired in a job, they don't count your commute time. They don't pay you for it. It's coming out of your personal time. So we don't see commute time as something you save and you give back to the company. No, it's your time. It's always been the employer's time. But if you look at like how commute length is correlated with divorce rate, those are shocking statistics. This is coming. It's not that people have nothing else to do. They have lots of things going on, and this is like 2 hours they really can't spare, and it's a no-brainer. And I hope we have great retention at GitLab because we're a good company to work for. But some people also say, like, look, I just don't want to go back to commuting.
Yeah, we have a similar experience, I think, at Job Portraits. It's just like all of us are like, oh, if I have to go back to an office, such a different experience. And I do think that, you know, we've talked to other companies that I do think really see value in being in the same location. And my sense is that you guys have addressed a lot of these concerns through your sort of protocols. But like, for instance, the idea of collisions, right? Which I know is very popular, that like Tony Hsieh talks a lot about, or that idea of just sort of random connection.
Serendipity, yeah,
serendipity. So I'm wondering, how do you address something like that, right? Or people just feeling personally connected rather than only connected through work. How do you guys address that remotely?
Yeah, so two very different things. So the collisions is like having people kind of interact with a lot of people at the company, and I think we tend to get higher quality interaction at GitLab because it's much more obvious. Like, you don't have to, like, I don't know, at Pixar, they put the restrooms in the central locations so people would bump into each other. I hope they didn't really bump into each other, but like, that's not a high quality interaction. You don't know what that person is working on at that moment. I think at GitLab, we have one of our values is transparency. So it's easy to see what people work on. You can look at their activity log if you actually want to know it of a person. But more importantly, we have lots of issue feeds and Slack channels where you can see that. And some people are even so interested, they subscribe to the change log of our handbook, where they see like tens and tens of changes every single day. So they can see across the company what's going on and who's doing what. So I think things like Slack enable a lot of serendipity that is work related. Now there's the totally different subject of informal communication. Like, I do believe there's a certain, like, you want to be able to see the person behind the work in order to build trust, in order to build kind of, I don't know, acceptance or respect for people that have different opinions. It's very important to keep realizing you're dealing with humans, and it's easy to lose that, especially in a remote environment. So, and we always turn our video cameras on and things like that. We don't try to like go back and forth over text if there's if you're disagreeing about something. But it's also important to get to know the person behind the screen. Every day we do breakout calls. Today the question we were asked was, if you were a talk show host, who would you invite? And lots of different answers, from Elon Musk to the famous lady who did field work with the chimpanzees. I think her name started with a J, but I forgot.
Jane Goodall, yeah.
Yeah, thank you. And that's fun. That's just 20 minutes of hanging out with coworkers, but not discussing work. Mm-hmm. We also have the idea of coffee chats, where it's okay to just schedule a meeting with someone for 25 minutes without an agenda. Like, you don't need an excuse. We actually, you have to do 10 of them when you join GitLab, just to get used to the concept. So great way to get to know someone. We do team socials, where every week you spend an hour with your team, just discussing things that are not work related. We have a travel stipend to visit other team members who travel the world. We bring everyone together and do excursions and an unconference together once every while. So lots of different ways to facilitate kind of informal communication. But you do have to organize it, because it's not a natural thing. And I think that's where remote breaks down. It's so efficient. You tend to only talk about work, because there's no waiting for other people to join the meeting. There's no walking over to a meeting. So we made the conscious decision, okay, we're going to allocate some time during the workday to not work. And I think people have to feel like that's okay. And that's why it's important to name all these concepts and get people comfortable with it.
Yeah, I saw those. I saw all of those meetings when I was reading through, and I thought that was really interesting.
Can I have one thing about getting everybody together? So Sid mentioned contribute. Every 9 to 12 months, we get everybody together. In an all remote setting, what ends up happening is people will like have this pinned on their calendar, just waiting to figure out where the location is. Like they can't wait to book a week of their year to go physically hang out with their coworkers and just spend time with them. Now compare this to a co-located company, where if someone says, hey, we're going on a week-long trip, immediately your first thought is, what's an excuse that I can get out of this? Because you take it for granted. You take the physical interaction for granted. You see these people every single day in person. And in some cases, you're like, the last thing I want to do is go spend a week with them somewhere else. So there's a lot of value in getting people together. And those moments tend to be more special because they're more rare. So it's just an interesting anecdote that I've seen over the years.
I think also why people look forward to that week is that we don't do death by PowerPoint that week. We don't make you sit to presentations 8 hours a day. We have an opening and a closing ceremony, but other than that, the only people who can do a slide deck are customers who also tend to attend and those things. But it's unconference like subjects that are raised by individual contributors. The most popular subjects sessions tend to be how to get motivated for work and how to prevent burnout. Separate conversations, but like very soft subjects that we discuss, and we just go on excursions together. So it's actually a fun week because it is the softer side of work during that week.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah, I was watching your video from Crete. It looked pretty incredible. Sandra, did you want to jump in with anything?
Sorry, I was muted there. And I think you guys are on a good tack. One very like small tactical question that I just, since we're remote as well, I wondered about when you were talking about the handbook. Is there any challenge in having 3,000 pages is you know, or is such a great resource, but do you have any challenges with kind of navigating that? Like, how did you make that like a really useful tool for your team? I know that for the navigation of the documentation versus the documenting itself can be a challenge for us.
Yeah, it certainly is a challenge to navigate that. I think it's super important to kind of keep restructuring it to make it as good as possible. There's a lot of cross-linking going on to help kind of discover related concepts. We have an important rule of not organizing by format. So no glossaries, no FAQs, no pages with just videos. Make everything about like the work that has to be achieved, what department, what task, and then organize around that and embed the videos and everything else. Define the concepts you need for that right there and link to other things you need. That helped a lot in organizing everything. I spent way too much time thinking about all of these concepts. I think there's another thing, and maybe the shadows can write this down later. It's really important that to highlight that we document in order to change things. So documentation is not dogma. Documentation is not what you have to do. If it's written down, it's more efficient to kind of to change things because you can see all the related concepts. You can think about the change. It's also more efficient to kind of communicate a change because like there's a canonical place for that. So where you naturally think that process and procedures kind of pin you down, I think in our case, it makes it easier to change things. And it's very important that people keep thinking about it like that. And it's actually in a lot of cases, we don't mind too much whether you follow it or not. Like we have a code of conduct and things like that. You got to adhere to that. But if you solve a problem in a different way, maybe that's not the biggest problem in the world. What is important that if you have a question about what should I do, that is answered. And I think that it should be like the reference, like, okay, what if you have a question, what should I do? Much more than bullying people in a certain way of doing things. And then hopefully if you do it in a different way, you meet the documentation and you're like, oh, well, my way is much better. You feel empowered to make that MR and send it up to your manager.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Thanks.
Yeah, I was thinking about like, you know, not only is this probably the biggest handbook that exists, but it's probably also the most read handbook that exists, right? Like I feel like every other company, it's this just like dead document that you read in your onboarding and you're like, I'm never looking at that again. So it's really fascinating how you've really created something with so much value. That it's a daily thing for people. So because a big part of what we're hoping to accomplish with this story is to, you know, share with other people tips and hopefully help them from like stop them from making the mistakes that maybe other people have made before them. I'm sure since you guys are constantly iterating and improving, I'm curious, and maybe Darren, you could start us off, but are there things that you like wish you had known earlier in the process or that you used to do differently and you stopped doing because it didn't work that well in the remote world?
It's a good question. I think it's just important when new people come in that you are sure that they believe that the values are real and they can be open and they can ask questions and they are empowered. Because if you're coming from a typical co-located corporation with silos and bureaucracy and those kinds of things, some things there that could be defined as career killing or career suicide are things that we really embrace here, that we really want you to do. Like we genuinely mean have short toes. Like you can't step on anyone's toes here because we all have short toes. So just say it. And if it's a bad idea, you'll find out pretty quickly and it's fine. At least you said it and you found out the answer instead of it stewing for a week and you waste all this productivity. So I think that's just a continual iteration on our onboarding. When we bring people on, it's like, it's not a trap. It's not a trick. This is a different way of working, and it's okay to go there and embrace it. That's for me, and we write this in the handbook. Iteration is a good example where everyone thinks that they know iteration, and then they get to GitLab, and it's like, oh, you mean like if I can make it 1% better, just ship it and then move on to the next 1%. You don't have to do this big 6-month plan with all this PowerPointing and all of that. It's not a trap. Like, that's genuinely the right way to do it. And to Sid's point earlier, all companies should do this, but being all remote and distributed across the globe just makes us do it faster. I think this is kind of an aside, but kind of related. I think we're coming close to the tipping point where instead of all remote or remote first companies having to justify why they do it, we're almost to the point where the co-located companies are going to have to start justifying why they continue to spend money and resources on the things that they do. So the questions are going to start shifting a little bit to the other side. Like, how did you make it work? And then it's going to go to the co-located side of, why do you continue to do it this way? Which will be fun. I'm looking forward to that.
Yeah. Sid, did you have anything to add?
No, I think that was great.
Yeah. And I mean, Sid, since this was obviously something that it sounds like it was just kind of like a default for you, right? It was like you started thinking you were going to be co-located, and then it just like kind of kept happening, that being remote, just made more sense. Like, what were the things that were really hard in the beginning? Like, what were the first couple of things you had to write in the handbook? Which, like, we really have to figure this out, right?
I think 2 things were hard. First of all was fundraising. We had a prominent, really great venture capitalist say, look, this company like ticks all of our boxes. Like, this matches we want to invest, except for this remote thing. So if you're not giving up on that, that's a risk to us. And we're not saying it's not going to work. You say it's a risk, and we don't have to take risks. We can get a company that doesn't have that risk. So that made sense. That's certainly true. But it was very disappointing for us. The other thing, and that's a thing still to this day, it will forever be a hard thing. Handbook first. Like, if you want to make a change it in the canonical source or propose a change there. The natural thing for people is to like write an email with how they want to see something different, or make a presentation, or do every single thing except actually change it there. So that's a very important thing to keep hammering on. Like, hey, this at some point should end up in the handbook. Then please start the handbook first. Please make that change to the handbook, and then let's discuss that proposal.
Yeah. I want to talk about a couple of other just sort of like core principles that I saw as I was reading, that seemed to me like they're super important. And I think people have talked about them generally, but you guys are just so like clear and targeted about them. So one that I saw is like asynchronous is better, right? Like basically all conversations should be asynchronous unless you have a really good reason. And I wonder if you could just talk a little bit about why that's so important for you guys.
Yeah, we have people in 55 countries, many time zones. So any meeting we have, there's going to be people who cannot attend. So if you have a proposal, if you have an idea, if you have a problem, create an issue, create a merge request to discuss it, and then everyone can chime in. We're not against working synchronous. It can be more effective, but it's mostly effective if you have a proposal, you're able to address most things, but you find yourself going back and forth with someone. Great, like schedule a call and discuss it, work it out. There's probably some confusion somewhere or not, or you can figure something out, or you can agree to disagree. But all of those things are easier in a call. So if it's 1 or 2 or 3 people, that's great. But most of the other things work asynchronously because it can be much more inclusive. And the hardest thing we have going on right now is like for the people in Asia Pacific to feel part of the company, because meetings naturally tend to gravitate towards things that are outside their working hours.
Do you have any good tips for how you're addressing that right now?
No, time zones are the bane of our existence. It's so hard. But work asynchronously. And luckily, our values are conducive to that. Our top value is results. So we don't measure your hours, we measure your output. And a lot of that is kind of visible in GitLab itself. We're transparent, so we write things down. So even if you weren't at the meeting, there's a recording. Even if you weren't in the Slack conversation, there's a handbook change. And then iteration. If you make smaller changes, there's fewer people you have to coordinate with. And this is so important. If you're making a 6-month planning, you need to coordinate with a lot of people. If it's for a much shorter amount of time, then you can just do it. And if it's off in its direction, the next iteration can adjust for that.
I also saw, obviously, it feels like transparency is almost just like a necessary part of working remotely because, right, like you just don't have time to tell everybody all the things, especially when they're not in place. But I also saw you said that you guys don't actually sort of use the term radical transparency, right? That you actually have some very clear limitations on transparency. I'm curious if you could talk about those a little bit.
Yeah, so we tend to be pragmatic at GitLab, like results is the most important thing. And radical kind of assumes some kind of impractical behavior. We don't want to be impractical. We do transparency because it generates more results. But we don't want to put the cart behind the horse. And the exceptions are, for example, our customers. Our customers don't always consent to like being named publicly. Certainly not if they, if it's something specific to them. Partners, we have partnerships, and those partners don't always like it. Financial information, we hope to become a public company, so we need to make sure that we disclose financials at a fixed point in time to on a fixed channel to everyone at the same time. I think it's grown to like a list of 15 exceptions to transparency, and one of the most important ones, in my view, is negative feedback. We try to keep that between you and your manager, or maybe your manager's manager, but if it's about the person more than a specific piece of work, I try to keep that to a limited group, not the entire. It's none of the business of your other team members.
Yeah, I was wondering too about feedback, and I'm imagining that having really clear, good feedback is like extra important also in a remote setting because you're not just sort of face to face, and you can't like feel that tension if something weird is happening.
Yep.
So, do you guys have, I don't know, what's your philosophy, or what are your guidelines around feedback and how you think about that?
I think about that a lot. You do have like one-on-one conversation with your manager with the webcam on. So hopefully if there's frustration or something, that already shows a bit. But yeah, have those conversations, be explicit. We also have many cultures. So there's a big mismatch to like the North American way of saying something is not okay. And like the European way of saying something is not okay. Mainland Europe, maybe then. Lots of different ways in which we kind of gather feedback from people as well. But it is hard. And for example, one of the really hard things about remote, seeing when someone is stuck or has a total lack of motivation, either stuck on a problem or just blocked in their work or in their motivation for work, it's much harder to see remote. But so it's important for the manager to like look at your contributing timeline. If it's been empty for 2 days and you're not out sick, then there's something wrong. Things like that.
Yeah. Darren, I'm curious, tell me a little more about your role. Like, are you sort of the one who's thinking a lot about these kind of, like the specific challenges that are coming up because of remote work and how to address them? And what are some common, what are some recent challenges you guys have faced, I guess?
Yeah, definitely. We have an entire section of the about.gitlab.com dedicated to all remote. So a lot of what I'm doing is standing up pages, and the thought process there is I wanted to stand pages up that expose challenges and present solutions, not necessarily just the way that GitLab is doing it, because we want other companies to see this and be inspired by it and implement it. That would be seen as a success for us if more all remote companies are born, even in small part because of what we're doing. We have an amazing competitive advantage right now being able to hire globally, but I would love for that to not be as much of a competitive advantage, because that would mean more companies are doing this, and the net benefit of that would far outweigh whatever we get right now. But things like async is something I think about, and I almost see it as a perk, because if you default to communicating asynchronously, you will default to documenting. And so your first instinct will be to go after a problem or an issue in a merge request or a GitLab issue where you document all of the steps and all of the discussions. So somebody can come in 4 weeks after it was started and catch all the way up, not just a he said, she said type of thing. And what's wild about this discussion is almost every multinational company has this same thing. If there's a San Francisco base and a London or Singapore base, they're remote to each other, and they're not gonna always, one of them be up at 3 in the morning to have this call. So they might as well just default to asynchronous so that it's documented all the way across. So yes, part of my role is thinking about challenges like this. I'm in Slack rooms all the time, and people will even ask things like, what kind of webcam should I get? What's the most ergonomic chair I should get? I'm looking for better webcam lighting, these kinds of things. So I'm going to stand up a page soon about home office. This comes naturally to me, but if it's your first time working remotely, you're like, oh, I have to design a room around a workspace. I've never had to do that before. So how do I go about that? And then part of it's just working with the marketing team and just amplifying the message of, hey, GitLab is pioneering what we believe is the future of work. And we want to get involved in as many ways as we can.
That's awesome. That sounds like a fun job.
It is amazing. I'm very grateful.
Yeah. I'm curious too about, do you guys, what characteristics do you look for? Do you encourage or try to grow in people so that they can be successful in a remote setting? Like, for instance, I know other companies say we're fine with senior people being remote, but we're worried about junior people who maybe need more support or something like that. Yeah, like how do you guys determine if someone can be successful, as a remote worker? Do you think it's everyone and they just kind of need the right kinds of support?
Yeah, so we strongly believe you should be a manager of one. I think that's a good practice in any company, but it's even more important if you're remote. So take responsibility for your own time allotment, your attention, and everything else. And that goes to the point where at GitLab we say, look, if you're in a meeting and it's not interesting to you, it's fine to do like email on the side. And if someone has to repeat a question because of that, that's totally fine. That's still an efficient way to allocate time. We do not hire juniors in most functions. So for example, in engineering, we'd really like to, but we don't yet. And I think it's much more to do with our growth rate, where you're like more than doubling every year. All of the focus is on hiring. And if juniors take kind of much longer time to be effective and contributing, and it would be a big damper on our productivity if we're growing at that rate. But I do believe that you can learn programming skills remote, and you can pair program and everything else. So I don't think it has to do with remote. I think it has to do with rate of growth.
That's interesting. I just thought of something pretty tactical too. I mean, obviously, I think we're trying to think about the people aspects of remote, right, and how it affects, especially hiring and recruiting. How do you think about putting out a job ad, right? Like or however, like, how do you think about, I guess, advertising your jobs in general when it's literally like anybody anywhere in the world? I think most recruiting teams are thinking about, we need to focus on like this location because we need people around this office. But it dawned on me that like it's actually an interesting, different kind of challenge where it's like we're trying to target anybody in the whole world. How do you guys think about that?
Yeah, two things. It's 90% of the world. There's some countries in which we won't hire people for a diverse set of reasons. And the second thing is we try to be more active in kind of sourcing people from like the locations that have lower market wages.
Mm-hmm.
And so if we have the option, we rather hire someone in Europe or in Canada than in San Francisco, just because it's more affordable for the company, and also to keep our team more diverse. The natural thing is almost to like hire in those big tech centers.
Got it. And are you guys, do you mostly rely on just sort of word of mouth and your own sourcing, or, you know, especially, I mean, you guys are really growing a lot right now. I'm just curious a little bit about your recruiting strategy.
It's mostly inbound, so we have about 3,000 applications a week. But we also like have a referral program. We also have sourcing. We sometimes do external recruiters. So it's a mix. But luckily, I think one of the biggest unexpected benefits of the handbook is the talent brand we built through that. I think a lot of the people who end up working at us is like, yeah, I read your handbook and I stayed up all night and I read it and then I just want to join the company. So here I am.
Yeah, I think that alone is like a pretty incredible story. Cool. Anything else? I think we actually only had like 45 minutes. So I apologize. I know we usually book an hour for this. So I hope I'm not keeping you from anything else, but any other like pressing things that you think we should know? Otherwise, I think we've got a lot of great stuff.
Yeah, no, I think this was great. Thank you so much for the interview.
Awesome. You guys too.
Thank you.
Yep. Have a great day.
Okay.